Welcome back. Let's get back to where we were. We want to start actually writing our code, keeping in mind that the more you prepare and understand what you need to code, the better the whiteboard will go. So never start a whiteboard interview not being sure of how things are going to work out. So we've talked it out. We have a plan in mind. Let's start to code this. Let's do the first loop over here. That is, we want to loop through the first array. And let's remove this code just so it's a little bit cleaner. We want to loop through the first array, create an object where properties are going to match the items in the array. I'm going to create an object. Let's just call this map. And this map, we've created it, but we want to loop through our array. So I'm going to say let I equals 0. And we've done this before. I is less than array1 dot length. We're going to increment I. Now within here, we're first going to say if there is no property. So we want to check whether map.a exists, map.b exists, map.c exists, map.x exists. So if that doesn't exist, in JavaScript, we can just use this syntax. We can say if no map I. So again, if map I, which the first time around is going to be A. So if map.a is the opposite, so this exclamation mark in JavaScript means the opposite. If map A exists, it's going to return true. If it doesn't exist, it's going to say false. So this might be a little bit confusing, but we want to say if this doesn't exist, in that case, we want to do something. Now, the way if statements work in JavaScript, it needs to be true in order to execute whatever is in here. So we add the exclamation mark here to turn false into true. I know that can be a little bit confusing. You can read up on it, but essentially what we're doing is we're just checking for the property, if it exists or not. If it doesn't exist, then we're going to add it. So I'm going to say const item equals array1 I. So that is A. And this item is going to have map item equal to true. What did we just do here? Well, we said if map A doesn't exist, in that case, let's make array1 I, which is A, equal to item. So map item is going to equal to true. All we're saying is map A, in this case, equal to true. So by the end of this, we're going to have an object that is going to have property A true. And we're going to keep looping through it until we have an object called map that has all these items, map A, map B, map C, map X equals to true. All right, it looks like we're able to achieve this. And we can just console.log here just to check what we have. I'm going to say console.log map. If I run this function, let's do contains common item 2, array1, array2. And let's minimize this a little bit so we can see. And if I run this, I'm going to make sure I spell that right, array2. Let's run. We see that we have A true, B true, C true, X true. Awesome. So now we have that working. Let's go through the second step. And actually, I just noticed here that this, the way it is right now, is checking I, which is 0, 1, 2, 3. But instead, we want to check A, B, C, X. So instead of I here, it should be array1 bracket notation I. So that is A, B, C, X as the property of the map. Lots of brackets here, but I hope that makes sense. So if I run this, we should still get the same answer. Perfect. Now, let's look at the second part here. We want to loop through the second array and check if the item in the second array exists on the created object. This should be fairly simple. All we need to do, and let's remove the console.log map here. All we need to do is to loop over the second array. Let j equals 0. J should be less than array2.length. And then we're going to increment j. And all we're going to say is if map, what do we want to check? Well, we want to check if it contains the first item in the second array, that is z, as part of its properties. Remember, our map object contains these properties. So all we're going to say is we're going to check the array2, and we're going to check the j index. So the first index, 0 of array2, is going to be z, then y, then a. And if that's true, if it does contain those things, because remember, when we evaluate this, it's going to return true if it exists. If not, we're just going to get undefined. We're going to say return true. Otherwise, at the very end, we can just say return false. Okay, let's see if this actually works. I'm going to just click run. And I get true. Okay, so I see that A and A match. What if I change this to something that doesn't exist, like R? If I click run, I get false. What if I change this to C? I get true. If I get this to X, I get true. If I change this to W, I get false. Awesome. So we've just coded something new, a new function that, if we look at, makes things possibly better, right? Because we have two for loops, one after another, which is OA plus B, versus before where we had nested for loops, which was OA times B. At this point, we can tell the interviewer, if the arrays are substantially large and we can get really large arrays, then this solution, when it comes to time complexity, is better. How cool is that? Now, let's go through the next steps because we're not actually done yet. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Number 11 is think about error checks and how you can break this code. Never make assumptions about the input. Assume people are trying to break your code and that Darth Vader is using your function. How will you safeguard it? So always check for false inputs that you don't want. But essentially, I now look at this code and say, how can I break this? Well, let's think this through. If I go through this code and let's say, what if I have two A's here and I run? Does this still work? Okay, what if I have A and A here? What happens? All right, I get true, that's good. But what if I have a number here instead of a string? We just assumed that the array is going to contain strings. I get false. Okay, what if I do 1 here? I get true. Okay, so that works. What if I do an empty array here? Okay, I get false. What if I do another array here? Okay, I get true. What if I do null here in JavaScript, which is a little tricky? Okay, I get false. What if I do null? I get true. Okay, that works. If we go back to what we had before, we want to now tell the interviewer how we might be able to break this code. For example, what if we don't receive a second array? What if this function is called with just one array? What happens? We get an error. We want to start thinking about how errors might arise. We want to make these functions as error-free as possible. And during an interview, you usually won't have time to do all the checks that you want, but you might want to tell the interviewer possible solutions or possible ways to go around this, such as, can we assume always 2 parameters in the function? Is what happens if in the second parameter I pass 0? Okay, I still get false. What if I pass null? I get an error that says I can't read length of null. So you want to start thinking about and maybe discussing with the interviewer how you may break this function and how you may improve it, such as doing checks, such as if statements, to make sure that what the inputs you are getting are what you are expecting. Now, this is when testing comes in and testing your code comes in. During most interview, that's usually beyond the scope of the interview and you have limited time, so you can't do this, but it's good to tell the interviewer what you would do. This is one of those things that it's simple enough that you can just tell the interviewer this is what you would do versus coding it, and they will essentially give you full marks for it. Let's look at the next step. Don't use bad, confusing names like I and J. Write code that reads well. Now, when I look at this function, it's okay. Now, I say don't use variables like I and J. And although I'm using I and J exactly here, this is being used for loops. And for loops, using I here is okay because it is a bit of a standard, especially in JavaScript, and these are just simply indexes. But perhaps if these parameters had meanings, such as maybe this was the user array and this was the items array, naming these as more useful, more meaningful variables or parameters might be better. Maybe this map variable can be called tally or something more meaningful, specific for the code. Again, this is one of those things that you can talk to the interviewer about and let them know that you're thinking about these things. And that's very, very important. Again, as long as you're thinking about that and you're telling the interviewer that you're considering these things, you're getting full marks for it. Let's keep going. Test your code. Checks for no params, 0, undefined, null, massive arrays, async code, so on and so forth. And we kind of covered this in the previous step, but you want to just check with the interviewer that we're making some assumptions here, but let them know that you're thinking about them. You're thinking about the fact that this function might not always be run with 2 arrays. How can we test this function, and how would you test this function to make sure that it gives the expected result, that we always return true or false? And this is where you might say that you're going to test your code and run some unit tests. Finally, even though I say finally here, there is another point, but finally, talk to the interviewer where you would improve the code. Does it work? Are there different approaches? Is it readable? What would you do, or what would you Google to improve? How can performance be improved? Well, looking at this code, I can start telling the interviewer that, okay, the downside to this solution is that, well, only numbers and strings and booleans can be used correctly because we're using an object, especially in JavaScript, and adding properties A, B, C, and X to this object. Now, object properties, especially the way we're using a JavaScript object right now, might not work if we're using non-literal values. Maybe not strings, maybe a JavaScript expression. And you might also argue that this code could be a little bit more readable. For example, although this code is better in terms of time complexity, when it comes to JavaScript, there's actually a more readable, cleaner way of doing this. Let me show you. This is something that is language specific. That means depending on how much you know about the language that you're working with, you might be able to use methods to simplify this process. So you can tell the interviewer, I would Google specific methods on, let's say, arrays to see if I can just clean up this code and make it readable. For example, I can do this exact same function, and we'll call it contains common item 3, that takes in array 1, array 2, and in one line, I can just return array 1 dot sum, which is a new feature, I think ES6 with JavaScript. And I can say item using arrow functions, which come with ES6. And I can say loop through array 2 dot includes and check if it includes the item. Whoops, not that item. Now, what do we just do here? Well, we're using some built-in JavaScript methods to do essentially what we've done above, which is check the first array, iterate through each item in the array, and if some of them include the items in our array 2, just return true or false. If we actually check this with our array, and I run this, and let's comment out the first one. If I hit play here, I got to make sure that this is includes, not include. I get false because our array doesn't have any matches. If it does have A and A matched, I get true. Look at that. I just created a nice little function using JavaScript here. How cool is that? This is what we talk about when we say there's different solutions to a problem. We now have a way to measure different solutions to a problem. We can say that there's actually another solution using some of the built-in methods that comes with JavaScript that is, some would say, more readable, more concise. If you're working on a team that really knows their JavaScript, this is a lot easier to read than this, right? So maybe readability is more important. You might say that this is a better solution. Another thing you may have noticed is that we've talked about time complexity here. And we haven't really talked about space complexity. And this goes into a final point. If your interviewer is happy with your solution, the interviewer usually ends here. It is also common, though, that the interviewer asks you extending questions, such as how would you handle a problem if the whole input is too large to fit into memory? Well, if we talk about space complexity here, we can see that in the first solution that we had, let me comment this out, we have space complexity of O1. Because we're not creating any new variables, we're just using the inputs arrays. Technically, additional space complexity for our function is O1. It's constant. But if we scroll down to this one, well, we're creating a new object here. And we're adding the first array into an object, which takes up memory. So this solution actually has space complexity of OA, which is the first array, space complexity. So if an interviewer says if there's limited memory or memory is expensive, you can just tell him or her, well, this solution, although faster in terms of time complexity, is more heavy in terms of space complexity. Now, this point here that we forgot to mention is something that, again, is really good to mention during your interview. Modularize your code from the very beginning. Break up your code into beautiful small pieces and add just comments if you need to. What does that mean? Well, we have the solution over here that we've worked on, and we've commented it out. We've modularized, saying that this first block of code is going to do something, then this block of code is going to do something else. But as code gets more and more complex, it becomes increasingly important to write in a modular way. That is, small bits and pieces that read like English. You see, long, really hard to read code costs companies a lot of money because it's not just you working on a code base. It's most likely tens, hundreds, if not thousands of developers and engineers. So companies want to hire somebody that is able to write clean code that is readable, that is easy for anyone to pick up and code along with. For example, here, what we might want to do is actually separate these out into different functions. Maybe creating a function in here that perhaps says map array to object that receives the first array item. And then maybe here another function to the outside world that says compare array to object. Now, you don't really have to do this during an interview, but it's good to mention it and talk about the idea of modularizing your code. If a function is doing too many things, that's not ideal. When we say modular, we want to build small pieces of code that do one thing and one thing really well. Ideally, a function takes an input and returns an output, and inside of that block does just one thing. If it has to do any extra actions, well, perhaps you have another function that lives on the outside world, and this function also does one thing really well. And this creates really testable, clean code that is modular. Again, something that is really good to mention and talk about in your interview. Whew. All right. I know this is a lot, and it's a lot to think about because now you start thinking, am I going to have to worry about each code that I write and analyze it this deeply? No. In your day-to-day life, you're not going to do that. But I wanted to demonstrate to you that this is the kind of thought process that really good developers have and what companies are interviewing for. If you're able to think clearly through these steps, like I have outlined for you, and you're able to solve problems this way, you see how much more impressive it is than if I just wrote down this solution without any explanation. Even if you don't get to this part and time runs out during your interview, you've demonstrated to your interviewer that you're able to think clearly. You have the fundamentals to think like an engineer. And these are great qualities that companies love to hire for and skills that are very rare. I hope you had fun with this exercise. You might have to come back to these videos later on. But for now, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.